Hi guys, so today I wanted to cover the material for analysis in Chapter 6 of the Dressmaker, and once again we'll be focusing our analysis on how it can be compared with the Crucible. So Chapter 6 starts off with this kind of imagery of William's car, the Triumph Gloria. I suppose it's not quite imagery, it's just a description. And the cars in this novel actually act as a clue to the time period where it's set. So we have Reginald Blood's Ford Prefect, we have the Morris Miners, and there are some other cars. Basically, they allude to this being set in the 50s. So Rosalie Ham is inspired by more modern issues, but she superimposes these on a bygone era, and that's comparable to what happens in The Crucible. So the two texts engage in what we call presentism. So presentism is the application of present ideas and moral judgments in historical contexts, or in this case, texts that are set against a historical backdrop. So some people frown upon this, especially when it's not on purpose, but in these texts, modern ideas and moral judgments are applied to get a point across. So, in The Dressmaker, there's this message about sexual deviance and liberation. Here, I suppose deviance is kind of a loose term that I would put in scare quotes, because it kind of shows us that while these things are historically taboo, there is, from a moral sense, very little wrong with them. In fact, there is nothing wrong with them. Now, in The Crucible, there's this commentary on McCarthyism and the Cold War era, and he takes this critique of Cold War the social climate in America, and he applies it to the Salem witch trials. And we talked about this a little bit earlier on. So coincidentally, Ham's novel is set around the same decade when The Crucible was first published and performed, but that's not really that important. It was just an observation. So the comparison of the way that they kind of superimpose their moral judgments on historical contexts really leads really well to a discussion about moral relativism and moral absolutism. So I'm just going to quickly define those terms for you. So moral relativism basically states that depending on the context and the historical period and the society that people live in, their sense of right and wrong can be different to ours. Whereas with moral absolutism, there's this belief that right is right and wrong is wrong, regardless of the context or the society that someone lives in. So these texts actually both contain some elements of each school of thought about morals. And we'll talk about this with regard to how the characters themselves think about morals and how the authors think about morals and how we can tell that in the construction of the texts. So, in The Dressmaker, Morally Ham suggests that certain precedents and certain contexts justify certain actions that may not be objectively morally right. And we see this in Tilly burning down the town. Now, obviously, it is not objectively morally good to burn down a town, but the text really focuses on how the town has kind of caused her to suffer, and we get a sense of satisfaction in the punishments that are given to the townspeople. And we talked about this a little bit earlier on in the second chapter, because we talked about how they received ironic punishments. Now, those ironic punishments make it seem more just because the punishments seem to fit the crime, and because of that sense of satisfaction we get from the punishment fitting the crime, we seem to believe that there's some kind of justice there. Now, let's move on to another point that Rosalie Ham makes. She suggests that some flaws are repugnant to us regardless of the historical context. So our present day is very different from the setting of the text, and one of the reasons why this message is, one of the ways that this message is brought to us is through the fact that we can look at the moral flaws and the shortcomings of a lot of these characters and still find them unsavory today. Now, there's also the implication that some historically unsanctioned actions are not inherently wrong. So this is basically saying that sometimes society tells us that we're not allowed to do certain things, but they're not inherently wrong. So, for example, Sergeant Farrett doesn't do anything wrong when he cross-dresses, and yet, from the perspective of what society tells him is acceptable, it seems to be, in scare quotes, wrong. And we see that in the fact that he tries to hide his cross-dressing from the people of Dunbarton, at least at first, and also the fact that he tried to hide it from his superior. Now, in terms of what the characters of the dressmaker believe, it's a lot more simple. So Beulah Harradine suggests that ethical wrongs are moral wrongs, and vice versa. So she finds things that she thinks personally are distasteful, and she says that those things are grounds for making people, get arrested. She says, "Oh, these kids are loud. They throw seed pods on my roof. Therefore, I should get law enforcement involved." Now, let's talk about the difference between morals and ethics. So, morals are your personal rules for how you want to live. They come from you and your own inherent sense of what's right and wrong. Now, ethics are the rules that we play by in order to go through society, in order to navigate society. It's kind of like society is a game, and ethics are the rules that you play by. So, there are also people in the text who demonstrate that ethical wrongs are not moral wrongs, and laws and societies are fallible. So we talked about this a little bit before with Farrett, but basically people like Farrett, Ruth, Nancy, and Molly show us that sometimes society and the law can be wrong. And people who are condemned by the standards of our society are not necessarily bad people. Now, in the Crucible, Arthur Miller basically asks, is there even an absolute right, and what about an absolute wrong? Basically, in a lot of the dilemmas that the characters are faced with, there is no absolute right and there is no absolute wrong, because at times there are people who have to lose out in order for other people to win, and sometimes our morals may be different to what others believe to be right. So he then asks, how do we define what is moral and what is immoral? Where do our conceptions of right and wrong come from? So once again, he doesn't offer us any easy answers. We will look at this a little bit later on in this video, but basically he suggests that our sense of right and wrong is instilled in us by society, but there is also an instinct for wanting to help others and an instinct for wanting to save those close to us and help those close to us. But we will get into it a little bit later. Now, once again, there's this difference when you compare the texts between justice and revenge. We will get to that in a little bit. Now, as for the characters of the Crucible, John Proctor seems to believe that sins are sins, regardless of what prompted them and the historical context. So, he cheated on Elizabeth, and he believes that a sin is a sin. There's nothing he can do to justify it. Likewise, he believes lying is a sin, and therefore there's nothing that can be done to justify lying. Now, an interesting case here is Rebecca Nurse, where you wouldn't think that her views are comparable to Beulah Harradine's because they're such different characters, but they actually, in some way, in some very twisted way, are very similar in their views about morals and ethics, because Rebecca Nurse also believes that ethical wrongs are moral wrongs and vice versa. And we'll get into that in a little bit again, because I have the next few slides dedicated to these specific topics. So, once again, ethics are the rules that you play by in the game. They're how you uphold the social contract between you and other people. we talked about the social contract a little bit earlier on in this video series. And morality is about your personal sense of what's right and wrong. So the characters' actions sit on a spectrum between the two when they try to do what's right and what's wrong. Obviously, this isn't the only spectrum that their acts and their actions kind of sit on, but this is kind of the basic spectrum that we want to look at the moment. So Beulah Harradine is immoral. That means she does things that are just wrong, and she knows that they're wrong because she hides them, she does them in secret. And sometimes amoral. That means sometimes she just doesn't have a sense of what's right and what's wrong. She just acts because she wants to. There's no kind of consideration of right and wrong. And she looks at everything with an this exaggerated lens of ethical scrutiny. She says who's upholding the rules and who isn't. But what's funny is that she places this lens and she views people through this lens, other people, but not herself. She seems terribly unaware of her own kind of ethical shortcomings. And because of her kind of fixation on ethics and her lack of consideration for morals, she kind of sees the two as the same. She says, if these people on an ethical level bother me, what they are doing is wrong. And when she says these people violate my personal rules about what's right and wrong, it is cause for law enforcement to come and deal with it, because it's clear that their personal lives are a violation of our social contract. So the two are the same to Beulah Harradine. Now, Horatio Ferat kind of undercuts the rules of ethics for what he perceives to be the moral good. He has very little respect for the rules of ethics. He cross-dresses despite knowing that society doesn't allow that. But moreover, it's not just self-serving. He undercuts the rules of ethics in that he doesn't file an accurate report of what happened when Teddy McSweeney died, in order to protect Tilly, because he understands that she is a victim. So he did what he thought was morally right and good, at the cost of doing what society and what the social contract asks of him. Now, Tilly, she tries to uphold the moral and ethical good at the start of this text, but she abandons both by the end, and yet we find some sense of justice to what she does, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, as I said before. Now, Elizabeth Proctor follows morals above ethics, and in this sense she's quite similar to Sergeant Farratt, in that for her it's more important to do what she personally feels is right over what society asks her to do. So when the judges ask her whether John Proctor cheated on her with Abigail, and whether she cast Abigail out of their home because of the affair that they had, she tries to protect her husband by saying that John Proctor is a good and faithful man. And in doing so, she unknowingly condemns him. But we see in that choice that she chose to do what she believed was right in her heart over what society asked her to do and told her was right. Now, John Proctor, he values ethics over morals. So he's kind of the opposite of Elizabeth, and he's the opposite of Farratt. He kind of says, lying is wrong. Society has told me that lying is wrong, even though, objectively, I don't have to condemn anyone in order to get by, and all that's at stake is my reputation, and if I sign this admission of guilt, this confession, then I'll be able to see the birth of my child and live on with my wife. He says, no, my reputation is more important and honesty is more important. So he kind of chooses ethics over morals, and there's another facet to this. Within the ethics that he chooses, there's also what we call deontological ethics and utilitarian ethics. So he's already chosen to follow ethics over his own morals, or over morals in general. And within that ethical choice, there's what we call a deontological choice, which is basically saying when we live in a society, we have to honor certain rules. And then there's utilitarian ethics, which say that when we live in a society, we should do what is best for the greatest amount of people. So, in signing the confession, he's not actually harming anyone, but he's hurting his reputation. So, he chooses to die with a good reputation, but in doing so, hurt Elizabeth and his family. And he chooses that over the utilitarian kind of approach to it. So he chooses a deontological approach. Now, Rebecca Nurse is interesting, and for her, ethics and morals are the same, but it's for a very different reason than for Beulah Harradine, because Rebecca Nurse applies both ethics and morals to herself. And in Rebecca Nurse, the two coincide because ethical rules are internalized when followed perfectly. So she plays perfectly to the rules of society. She says, I'm going to be a good Christian, I'm going to be generous, I'm going to believe in pacifism, and I'm going to always do what society tells me is right. Now, for her, her morals and her moral agenda and her ethical agenda are the same, because what she believes is what society tells her to believe, is right anyway. And for her, she's not really faced with as much of a dilemma as John Proctor, because John Proctor, in signing his confession, isn't giving anyone else away. He's not hurting anyone else. But that same offer hasn't been extended to Rebecca Nurse. So for her, the two don't quite clash in the same way that they do for John Proctor. Now, finally, we have Hale, at least Hale at towards the end of the play. And for him, it's always morals over ethics, and it's utilitarian ethics over deontological ethics. If it were up to him, he would choose the exact opposite of what John Proctor chose. He would choose to live on because life is the most precious gift. That is what he believes in personally. And for him, that's more important than having a good reputation. So the greater good, what is good for more people and causes the least pain, is more important than that rule of, oh, I shan't lie, I should not lie. Now, here's what I wanted to get into before about Myrtle and Abigail. And when we compare them, it's all about justice and vengeance. Because when you think about them, they're actually quite similar. So both of them are, in a way, victims. When you consider the objective facts, Myrtle was bullied, and then she was blamed for her bully's death when she wasn't really, she wasn't supposed to be held accountable for it if the world was fair. She is made to deal with the townspeople's kind of criticism and ostracization of her and her mother as a result. So she is a victim. Now, the Crucible doesn't focus on Abigail as a victim, but if you think about it in terms of the objective facts, she is a victim as well. So she's an underage girl, she's a teenage girl who engaged in this sexual relationship with an older, adult man, and she fell in love with him, but he didn't love her, and if he did, then he loved her less than his wife. And so when she was cast out, he didn't seek her out anymore. So in a lot of ways, both of them are victims. So why is it that Myrtle's actions seem just and Abigail's actions seem vengeful? Well, it's about the focus of the texts. So the texts really focus on Myrtle's suffering, and they don't focus on Abigail's suffering. And as I said before, with Myrtle, there's a sense of justice in what she does because of that sense of satisfaction we get from a fitting punishment. Whereas with Abigail, her condemnation of the people of Salem doesn't feel just because the people of Salem didn't do anything wrong. The only person who truly wronged her, as far as we know, is John Proctor. And there's a greater focus on the good and the suffering of the townspeople than there really is in the Dressmaker. When we look at good and suffering, the only people who really exemplify good out of the townspeople are Irma and I would just say Irma. There are some people who are tolerable, but the only person who kind of gives us a sense of benevolence is Irma. Now, back to chapter 6, that was quite a big tangent, but it's one that we had to go on to support your analysis. We see Faith and Reginald flirting at the Pratt's store, and one thing that Rosalie Ham really emphasizes are the gold rings on Faith's finger, on her fingers, and how they twinkle. And the reason that she draws attention to that is to show us just how shameless, I suppose, their flirting is, because Faith is a married woman, and Rosalie Ham intentionally inserts that to remind us of that. Now, there is foreshadowing of an unhappy and dispassionate kind of marriage between Gertrude and William, because he seems to ignore her, and his attention was always on the thick account file, even when she brushed up against him, and we see that she put on red lipstick for him and he only gave her a glance and then left. And we see this kind of cruelty in Alvin Pratt towards his own daughter. He says, and you can block out this entire section from the words "the idea," and then least of all William Beaumont, that entire section, because he doesn't seem to believe in his own daughter, and he thinks of her as lesser for her looks, and he suggests that William Beaumont is, out of her league. So there's this kind of cruelty, this two-faced, two-sidedness that we see to him, and we saw earlier on as well, in that on one hand he seems very friendly, but on the other he's quite calculating, sometimes cruel. And we see Muriel, who came to stand beside her daughter. Now, yes, it is literally saying, oh, she came to stand beside her daughter, she walked there, but also it's the idea that she supports her daughter, and we see that when she talks about the dance, because when you take that in conjunction with the words "came to stand beside her daughter," there's this implication that she believes that it is an opportunity to win William Beaumont over. In chapter 6, we also see Myrtle's flashback, and it foreshadows what will happen between her and Stuart Pettyman, because his actions there are blamed on her too in the flashback. Now, what's interesting here is that Myrtle is never referred to as Tilly in the flashback, and the reason is because when she is already flashing back, there's no further regression for her to take, but that's kind of a meta point. What's more important is that the two names and the fact that they show up in very different contexts suggests this kind of split in her personality. So it's almost as if the character Myrtle died, the little girl died, and was replaced by Tilly, the kind of traumatized adult who came here for healing, and that Tilly replaced Myrtle. Now in chapter 6, we also see an interaction between Marigold Pettyman and Evan Pettyman. So what's interesting is that the flowers, marigolds, despite their very cheerful appearance, symbolize cruelty, jealousy, and grief. And there's this, there's a kind of irony here. Or perhaps you could think of it as a name that's over-apt for this context, where Marigold is treated with cruelty, so she returns that cruelty. And there's this kind of idea of jealousy in that I suppose she's not jealous because she's always drugged up, but Jealousy tends to be associated with cheating partners, and her partner is cheating on her. Not because he isn't sexually attracted to her, but because he finds other prospects more attractive, and he's a bit of a pervert um, and just not a very savory character. Now we see that she suffers from OCD and very likely some other comorbid anxiety disorder. And there's an implication, a very strong implication, that Evan's actions within their marriage made her worse, be it the drugging, the intramarital rape, or whichever one came first, the disorder or the drugging. And there's a lack of graphic detail in the sex scene. And we see that that's kind of uncharacteristic for Rosalie Ham, because her sex scenes tend to have graphic detail, at least to some degree. But here there is no detail because there's this sense of passivity. Marigold isn't playing any active role in it. She is literally lying there drugged up. So there's no sense of feminine power, there's no feminine sexuality to reclaim there, and it highlights how unsavory the act is, in that the details seem unspeakable to us when we compare it to the normal scenes that she writes. Now, at the end, we see that there's this part where it says her Savaloy reddened hands, and that's foreshadowing, and it kind of tells us that she is that she's going to kill her husband, because Savaloy red hands suggests her hands steeped in blood. Yeah, so thanks for watching. I hope you guys learned something, and I will see you in the next video.